thank you so much for coming on and being my guest today.
Hi, Alison. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this. So today we're talking about tiny homes in and around the district. So, we will kind of be covering DC, Maryland, and Virginia with the, blanket understanding that there are differences throughout potentially. But there are multiple reasons why I wanted to talk about this topic. Like the first is, like a lot of people on Instagram and all of the social media sites, I think tiny home living is cool.
Mm-hmm.
It looks cool. It's awesome, like what people do with the space. But secondarily, something I've talked about on this show before is that there's a lack of housing shortage, there's a housing shortage. There's housing affordability is a major kind of concern in the DC area. And tiny homes could, in my opinion, be something that helps bridge the gap or help get more people into home ownership or home ownership type, living situations. And so I want to thank you for coming on because you came up time and time again when I was doing my research, been trying to find a guest for this, and you definitely know your stuff. So thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So maybe you can just kind of start off by telling people how your journey started going into tiny home ownership and let everybody kind of know this breadth of experience that you have.
So I grew up moving every 2 to 3 years. My parents were educators and they started working in international schools. So I never really had a home where I lived throughout my entire life. And so I'm kind of used to like a nomadic lifestyle. And I got to DC back in 2008 and didn't see myself staying there forever. But I was at a point in my life where I also wanted a home for myself. And I really didn't want to invest in real estate in DC. I thought it was overpriced at the time. And now, gosh, 12 years later, had I only invested then. But I was like, no, I'm going to take some savings and build my own little house on wheels. I had been familiar with tiny homes on wheels, even though they weren't a big thing then. In fact, I usually had to educate people when I said I wanted to do it, what it was. I had a hard time finding anyone in DC who had built one, but I did find a few people on the East Coast. And yeah, I just decided one year, I think it was like 2010, I was like, I'm going to do this. I don't know how. But I'm going to do it. And then in 2012 is when I actually started building, and we had acquired an alley lot in DC. This was before they were rezoned to be buildable. And so there were a group of us, 4 of us, who were building there. And we kind of had like a showcase of tiny homes, and we all built there. And then once we were done with that, we moved our tiny homes and lived in them in other places, usually in backyards. And yeah, so I lived in my tiny home full time for about 4 years. And then I did end up buying a regular house too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, you don't have to just do one thing over the other, right? We do things at different times. And, something I want to point out is you recognize in the beginning that you didn't want to invest in real estate, in part because you had a relatively nomadic lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And there are statistical break evens in the city for if you buy and then you sell, when you'll, make your money back, basically. So If you buy and you sell within a year, you're probably going to lose money if you just talk about the cost of the transaction. So that's actually something I tell a lot of my clients who come to me if they're trying to decide if they should buy or not. I say, how long do you realistically think you'll be here? Of course, knowing that everybody's plans can change, or, things can happen that cause you to change your intentions. But that's point and center. So, when we start talking about the costs later about building a tiny home, it's not that they're super cheap. You're not getting one for $5,000, but you can potentially move it.
Exactly.
And that's a huge consideration. Yeah. That's not going to happen when you buy a condo or a townhome or a single family house in this area. So, something to consider. And not also, we want to point out, because I read this in a lot of the articles, you actually built your tiny home yourself, right?
I did. I wasn't going to plan to do that. I hired a friend of mine to help build, and then I was dating an architect at the time, but I became heavily involved in the process and ended up building a lot of it myself. So I loved it. I'd never built anything before, and it was very, very rewarding to be able to learn those skills. And they helped me with my home that I ended up buying later too, just a couple of years ago, because I did a lot of renovations on it.
Yeah, well, and it also it points out that there's a reason why people have come to you for advice and, to learn about the whole process is you've really done almost all of the steps. If
Yes.
not, you have done all of the steps yourself.
Correct.
And that's, trial by fire is, something kind of sounds like you did a little bit. And since then, I'm sure now that you've learned more, as you've gone along and you've helped other people. So you don't just sit there and read, pamphlets and pass on that information. You've done it all.
Right.
So you're a really good resource for everything having to do with tiny homes, not even just even this in this area, but certainly this is where you started off. So,
right.
A decent amount, if not a lot about here. Right. So I guess there are some points of clarification I think we should probably make, and I'll let you take this one just about, what is a tiny house and how are these defined? Because there's a lot of gray area in this whole space. So maybe we can explain that to our listeners.
Absolutely. So I think usually when we say tiny house now, people think about a tiny home on wheels, which a lot of cities are now classifying them. They call them movable tiny homes. So I just want to make that distinction. They're both the same, tiny home on wheels or movable tiny home. However, tiny homes are also just small houses on a foundation. And so accessory dwelling units are considered tiny homes. And, DC in their 2015 zoning rewrite allowed for accessory dwelling units to be built in a few of the wards. So those two processes are different when it comes to zoning. A tiny home on wheels, unless it's in a jurisdiction, there are several jurisdictions in California which are allowing tiny homes on wheels to be considered accessory dwelling units. So then they become a permanent residence that can be in the backyard of a main house. But in most jurisdictions, that's not the case. And so but de facto, they're just considered an RV or a travel trailer because the foundation is a trailer.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good distinction. And so if, there are things that we can talk about as far as a tiny house, I think I read has to be is 400 square feet or less. Mm-hmm. Does that play into some of the things we're talking about, like zoning, et cetera?
Well, it does. So usually the 400 square feet or less, it's just kind of a way to typify housing. If it's on a trailer, you have to meet Department of Transportation requirements. So you can't really get much bigger than about 325 square feet with those requirements. However, the 400 square feet, certain jurisdictions, if they allow accessory dwelling units, they can only be 400 to 600 square feet, or they can be under 800 square feet. In Seattle, it's under 1,000 square feet. So it really varies. As you know, zoning changes. Every jurisdiction is different. So Montgomery County is different than PG County, is different than DC, is different than Anne Arundel. All the different counties classify things a little bit differently.
Sure. And do you happen to know why there are only certain wards that allow the accessory dwelling units? I'm just curious.
I'm not sure. And I'm not sure if they've changed that because I haven't looked into that in the last couple of years, but I was involved in some of the listening sessions and things back when the zoning rewrite was happening. And I'm assuming, I honestly don't know because I think I remember that Ward 5, you couldn't. And that doesn't make any sense to me because there's actually a lot of large backyards in Ward 5. So I'm not sure how that came about. I probably remembered back then, but COVID memory.
Yeah.
I forget.
Yeah. I mean, I think these next couple of years after, fingers crossed, after things start to get back to normal a little bit, we've had resources in every city pulled from certain, working on certain projects to just working on things that nobody anticipated with the pandemic. So I can't imagine a huge amount of change has happened in the tiny home kind of legislation and updates in DC over the last couple of years. One really hopes. So you started mentioning kind of LA, Portland, Seattle, and how they have more progressive rules surrounding this. It seems that the trend would be that all other kind of urban areas would start to make changes like this as well in the coming years.
Yeah, we hope so.
Yeah. The situation I've been presented with clients before is, a couple of my friends want to buy some land / a home and put a tiny home on it. And so, my involvement in tiny homes is fairly nominal in that, minimal, I should say, because I'm not going to help them build that tiny home, and we'll get to that later. But understanding where they can put that home and where this is possible is clearly something that needs to be considered. If somebody were to want to do that, if somebody were to want to go in with a friend, say, buy an existing piece of land or with a home on it, and it has zoned for being able to put a tiny home there, what are kind of the things that need to be navigated by those people? Both, let's just say both of them together. Let's say there's one who's going to live in the tiny home and one in the main house, if you will. Kind of what steps would somebody need to go through?
Yeah, let me clarify again that they first, if they want to build on a foundation, they need to see if accessory dwelling units are allowed there. And then they would go through the regular process that you would go through with pulling a building permit and, doing everything with the building, department to get that approved. So that's kind of almost like regular construction process, right? For building new construction, except you're building an accessory dwelling unit. In DC itself actually has a pretty good service online. Like you can go and look up accessory dwelling units and I can walk you through the process and what that takes. And there are actually now architectural and design build firms in DC that are specializing in ADUs. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is they could put a tiny home on wheels on the property. Now that is a very gray area of zoning because as I mentioned before, de facto is just considered a travel trailer or an RV. And back when I did mine in DC, it was legal to park an RV on private property, but it couldn't be considered your full-time permanent residence. So what most people do who do live in their tiny homes is that they look for something like a group house in DC where they'll rent out a room in the main house. And then they've got their private project, their studio in the backyard where they spend a lot of time. And so it's that gray area. Well, technically I'm on the lease in a main house. I have a space there, but I've got my tiny home in the yard and it's their little studio.
Right. And so ostensibly in that situation, they are actually sharing some of the things in the house, even if they're not sleeping there. That's where potentially they're using laundry or, maybe they're using the bathrooms in the main house in addition to one that they have on, in the tiny home. So, when you're dealing with the, so let's kind of talk about some more specific things like zoning code. We're starting to get into that. Are there communities where people tend to gravitate towards let me back up. I think a lot of people see Instagram and various social media sites and they see people building these awesome things like a converted bus or, or whatever, a van. And they're not really, and it sounds great to be on your own, traveling, but what happens when you're not traveling and you need kind of a place to stay for longer than like a couple of days, right? You're not staying in a van down by the river, but you want your van to be in more of a community. Are there communities in and around the area that exist where people can kind of be resources for one another?
There are not right in the area. I would say the closest one, I think there's a campground / RV park that has some tiny homes and vans there out in Maryland. I want to say about maybe 45 minutes, an hour out. The closest really established community is in Lancaster County in Pennsylvania, tiny estates. And that's probably the closest that's an actual established tiny house community. And then I think there are some in development in Virginia. Unfortunately, what we've seen in the tiny house movement is a lot of people starting tiny house communities are doing so for short-term rentals. So it's like the Getaway Project, right? That's out in Virginia. You can rent one for $200 a night. Oh, well, great. You can't live there full time. I can't bring my tiny house there and live there. So there's unfortunately not a lot of tiny house communities yet for full-time living. And those that are getting started are former mobile home parks or RV parks that are seeing the need, and they can be quite expensive, but there's not any right in the DC area as of now.
I mean, not that I really want to go down the hole of talking about RV parks, but RV parks kind of provide services though, right? Like if I would think that would have people who come and clean your the toilets and all that kind of stuff. So there could be a benefit to having one of those closer to the district, I would think.
I mean, it's in an urban area. You're not going to have one probably right in an urban area, but outside.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, you can get, within 20, 30 minutes of DC and still get a lot of land, depending
Mm-hmm.
on which way you're going. And of course, when you're dealing, what traffic you're dealing with. But yeah.
Right.
Um, but I was starting to say it's funny that you mentioned getaway house because that was my first foray into
Oh,
staying in
okay.
a tiny home
Mm-hmm.
when in this area. So I think I've said on air before, but I'm a burner. I go to Burning Man every year. So I've stayed
Nice.
in lots of converted I've stayed
Yeah.
in lots of converted kind of spaces, but that's for a week, right? And of course, like they're wacky and, because that's what you would come to expect from Burning Man. It's not really like your full-time home.
Right.
But I did, do the tiny home, 2 night stay. And yeah, it's certainly not cheap. It's, I think you said it is about $200 a night. You can get it for 150 if you stay on like a Wednesday,
Mm-hmm.
which pre-pandemic, everyone was like, who's staying on a Wednesday? And now it's booked up for months. I look every so often
Oh,
just to
wow.
see. Yeah, I mean, well, because you can work from anywhere during the pandemic. I mean, no one's expected to go into the office. And
True.
so, it makes sense. Like go to the cabin in the woods or sorry, tiny home on wheels in the woods and, and work from there. Um, okay. So back to trying to kind of navigate if we want to do this ourselves. So
Mm-hmm.
we're in DC. We have, again, the people who potentially want to buy a home and build a tiny home or a home on wheels. Is there let's just say I want to buy a house and I don't have somebody who wants to live in my property, but I'm willing to have that happen on my property. Is there a
Right.
marketplace for that? Like how would somebody navigate that?
Yeah, it's pretty informal right now. There is a site run by a woman in Maryland called Search Tiny House Villages. So if anyone has space, I highly encourage you to post it there because a lot of people with tiny homes who are looking to rent land or someone's backyard, they go there. And then I would say it's on a lot of private Facebook group sites. Like we have a DC Tiny Houses Facebook group where people will post, hey, I'm looking for land. And someone was leaving a site in Manassas and he's like, hey, now the property owner would love to have another tiny house here if anyone wants to move out to Manassas. So it's kind of informal because it is a small, it's pretty much a small community. It's a tiny community of tiny home owners.
And is it the kind of thing where people are usually looking for a month, a year? Is there a
I would say
typical kind of
longer term. I would say mostly longer term, 6 months to a year minimum, because it's kind of a lot. People think like, oh, you can just move it. I mean, in my tiny house, I have a deck that I built. I have to disassemble the deck. You have to there's a lot that goes into moving it. You need to pay someone who's insured with a big truck with it. It's not something you're just going to whip around like an RV and just like, oh, I'm here for a couple days.
That's important to point out, I think, because you say wheels, and I think everybody has this thing in their minds that this is like super portable, right? And like
Right.
from you just like get it from here to there, no
Yeah.
problem. And there are people who make vans into tiny little homes, whether or not
Mm-hmm.
they can truly live in that for long term. I
I
mean,
know. I'm suspect.
I think yeah, I'm not sure I could do that. I mean, a cross country trip or something for a month, sure.
Yeah.
But, for more than a couple of months, I think that would be hard for a lot of us.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, okay. So the marketplace you talked about is basically Facebook. Thank you for giving us that name too, because I'm sure that's helpful. And, so if somebody does want to build their own, they do want to join this movement, they live
Mm-hmm.
in DC, Maryland, Virginia. What advice can you give people to start to do things legally right, to really make sure that they're doing things, correctly and so that they can, sleep well at night?
Well, the number one thing is if they have property already, if they're going to build on a foundation or not. If you're building on a foundation, it's pretty easy. I mean, it's not easy, but the process is easy because it's already out there in all jurisdictions what you need to do to pull a build permit. You can look up the minimum size house that you're required to build, all of that. If it's on wheels, you have to be comfortable being in the gray area of zoning. I built mine 10 years ago now, and I know a lot of people in DC with tiny homes, and I know maybe of one that had to move their house because of zoning or something. So you got to just know how to do that. I do teach a whole webinar on tiny house zoning and giving people tips and figuring out that whole process. But it's really then about finding a good builder, or if you're going to build it yourself, learning, how to do it safely. We're lucky now that there are more standards, and there are a couple of different accrediting programs throughout the US if you're building it yourself, that you can get your tiny house accredited or, go with a reputable builder. But I do really caution people to do your research, because the tiny house movement is exploding. We do see a lot of people just getting in and saying, oh yeah, I can build you a tiny house. And I've seen people taken advantage of. I've seen people get $40,000 down payment and not have anything to show for it. So do your research and due diligence before committing to buying.
So that I'm glad you gave the example of people giving kind of outrageous down payments. So what's a typical cost to build this kind of tiny home, you think?
Right. Well, it really depends. I mean, if you're building it yourself and you're a skilled builder, then you're not paying labor. So my cost estimates are pre-pandemic. So unfortunately, cost of materials have gone up a lot. But we used to say that you could, the materials alone, $30,000, $35,000. But off-grid systems, for instance, my off-grid water system for my tiny house cost me $1,000, right? I had to get pumps and a really nice filtration system they sell in Europe. And so it really depends on if you're doing things off-grid, on-grid. There's a lot of different things that go into the cost. If you're buying one from a builder, for instance, one of my favorite local builders, I say, because they're in Pennsylvania, is Liberation Tiny Homes. And they still have their lower cost model now, I think, or it starts at around 50 or 60,000. So it's not cheap. And then it goes all the way up to 100,000.
Yeah, I mean, because if we're talking about housing affordability, if we're talking about options while you're trying to, live in a home that's yours, if you don't want to rent, it's part of the problem, or one of the things that stop people from being able to get into the housing market is down payment.
Right.
And while everybody or a lot of people will tell you need 20%, you don't. Mm-hmm. But even 5%, 3%, 10%, that's no small chunk of change. Right. That's something that people still, and so when you're building a tiny home, that's also, that it not going to be cheap. I mean, it depends what your definition of cheap is, right? But I would say that that's not cheap.
No.
The difference, of course, is that you can port it, right? Which is something we kind of talked about, is that you don't have to sell it once you're not living in that area anymore. So that's obviously part of your cost benefit, analysis that you're doing. Do you know if you can finance these tiny home builds?
Yeah, it used to be harder, but now with the growth of builders and certifications, most builders will offer some sort of financing, and they usually are able to do that by getting RV certified, and then they're able to offer RV loans. And so if an individual wanted to finance it themselves, they could look, for instance, I know on my, when I work for the government with my retirement plan, I can take out an individual loan. And one of the options was to buy an RV. And part of that was you could do it to do a self-built RV. So there are options like that. Now, those loans usually have a higher interest rate than a regular mortgage, but it's the way to do it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's good to know, because, I feel like if I ever did this, that I would want to pay cash for it or something. Yeah. But, if I could get a loan, there's a reason why people they get mortgages sometimes, or that they don't put as much money down into a down payment as they can. So, okay, I guess last question then, how much time does it really take, do you think, if I decide today, I want to do this, I want to build a tiny home and I want to move into it. Is there like a period of time you think somebody should lay out for that whole process?
Yeah, I would say definitely not faster than a year, because if you're going to build it yourself, a builder who is a builder who's just a regular builder and is skilled in that, they say it takes them about 3 months to do a tiny home. If you're going to buy a tiny home right now, most of the good builders have a pretty substantial wait time. If you are willing to buy an already existing tiny home that someone's selling, that's actually sometimes a good way to go, because tiny homes do not appreciate in value like regular real estate. And that's because why am I going to pay it? The land's not attached to it. Tiny homes on wheels, so they don't appreciate in that way. But also, why am I going to pay in such a small space? It's usually customized to how that person lives. So why would I pay $60,000 for a used tiny home when I can get one built for me for $60,000 exactly to the specs I want? So you can usually get some good deals if, you know, someone's looking to sell their tiny home as well. And that would be a faster way then to get in.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. But I feel like I'd probably be in the school of like, well, I want, if I only have 350 square feet, damn it, I want it to be exactly the way I want it
I
to
agree.
be, you know?
Yep.
But I mean, yeah, I mean, it's at least good to consider, because you might stumble upon, you know, somebody else's, you know, tiny home that they're selling that's very close to what you want. You can spend a minor amount making some modifications.
Exactly.
So.
Yep.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on. This has been so awesome and educational. And I think it's important that everybody knows that this is really kind of a first stop, potentially listening to this, and that you have a ton of resources and you are a massive wealth of knowledge. And so I'll be linking your information in the show notes. So if anybody wants to reach out to you, obviously, if anybody wants to reach out to me because you want to get a home that can have a tiny home or an ADU built on it, then we can chat about that. And Lee, thanks so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Allison.